As Dr. Clark said, we have three internationally renowned archaeologists to listen to this afternoon. And the first one is one of our own, so to speak. Kent Bramlett is professor of archaeology and the history of antiquity right here at lasierra University. He grew up in Washington State, where he had the unusual experience from his living room window of watching Mount St. Helens blow. Not many people can compete with that. His undergraduate experience was at Wadi Al Jarf University, and his first graduate degree from Andrews University and a PhD from the University of Toronto in Near Eastern archaeology. In addition to his teaching responsibilities, which are the archaeology classes, history of antiquity, and some of the Hebrew Bible classes, he is the chair of the Biblical Studies Department in the HMS Richards School of Divinity here. He's the associate director and curator of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology, and he's the co-director of the Balu Regional Archaeological Project in southern Jordan, at the largest tell site in the south. He's an avid photographer and a world traveler, usually with his two teenage boys. I've had the privilege of leading trips with him to Egypt, and it's fun to watch the travelers see him reading hieroglyphs right off the walls of the sites we visit. So his topic today is inventing the pyramids. Kent, the time is yours.
Well, thank you, Larry. Yes, volcanoes did pull a bit, but hey, here I am. Archaeology won out. The Egyptian pyramids were invented twice. First by the ancient Egyptians, and again in the Western esoteric tradition. One is history based on archaeological data and careful analysis. The other is shrouded in the speculations of Hermeticism, Theosophy, and the ruminations of ancient astronaut theorists. Oddly enough, the rediscovery of the former is intertwined in the convolutions of the second. Let's explore both. Recorded speculation on the origins of the Egyptian pyramids begins with the Greeks. And henceforth, I'll just refer to the pyramids. Understand I'm talking about the Egyptian pyramids. There's a veritable who's who of Greeks who traveled to Egypt in the Greek Archaic and Greek Classical eras. And of course, the Greeks ruled Egypt in the Hellenistic or Ptolemaic age. Among them, Thales, Pythagoras, Solon, Herodotus, each made journeys to Egypt in search of ancient wisdom, mathematical and architectural knowledge. Thales, from Miletus, in Ionia in the 6th century BC, gives little by way of general narrative of his Egyptian travels. He was mostly interested in measuring the Great Pyramid's height by means of geometry, and his measurements of the height of the Great Pyramid at 481 feet is still considered accurate for the original height with the casing and capstone in place. It's now closer to 450 feet. Herodotus in the 5th century was the first of the classical era to leave a description along with a fair bit of speculation. He imagined the Egyptians must have used a system of simple cranes to hoist the building blocks up by layers. But his eyewitness description of the 4 triangular sides of the Great Pyramid of Khufu as still perfectly covered in highly polished limestone rings true. It's plausible. And the joints were so fine you could hardly see where the one stone was up against the other. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, wrote that the Egyptians utilized piles to construct the pyramids. Most think this refers to earthen ramps. He too indicated the Giza pyramids were intact. Pliny the Elder and Strabo also wrote about the pyramids. Although Strabo's 47-book historical sketches, published in 20 BCE, is no longer in existence, save for a few quotes in other literature. His 17-book appendix, Geographica, does survive. And I would vote for Strabo's complete history if any more lost work should be discovered, maybe in Palimpsest's work or in the charred scrolls of Herculaneum. Anyway, I can wish, I can dream. Perhaps it was this background of geometry, mystery, and the evident reverence of the classical Greeks for the antiquity of Egyptian civilization that led European Renaissance and Enlightenment adventurers to believe that the Great Pyramid encoded ancient wisdom and knowledge, and perhaps even held the keys to the future if properly decoded. During or around the 1st century AD, a group of anomalous scholars had compiled a Greek translation of some of the much older Egyptian writings covering a huge range of subjects, from relatively grounded inquiries into natural phenomena to expansive religious and spiritual meditations. For unknown reasons, either the translators themselves or the transcribers who followed them attributed it all to a single long-dead sage known as Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes the Thrice Great. And Hermeticism is closely related to Gnosticism and Neoplatonism of the early Christian era. When the so-called Hermetica made its way to Europe from Constantinople, along with many other ancient writings about a millennium later, it was widely embraced by European thinkers. Hermetic thought influenced Francis Bacon, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Boyle, and even Newton, and other luminaries of the scientific revolution. This might seem contradictory, but its catchphrase, as above, so below, seemed to connect the cosmos with the mundane. Renaissance Hermeticism had a deep influence on the scientific revolution. Renaissance Englishman John Greaves traveled to Egypt, along with his many other adventures, and in 1638 made the best measurements up to that point of the Great Pyramid. These numbers, when he published them, gave Newton much data to work with. And among other things, Newton determined the length of the standard Egyptian cubit to be measured at 20.63 English inches in length. Davison, another explorer from this time period, Nathaniel Davison, who had become the British consul for Algeria, traveled on vacation to Egypt along with a friend, then a bookseller, I think, but with a government background. Davison was adventurous, and while exploring the Great Pyramid, looked for hidden tunnels and nooks and crannies to poke around in. He spotted a small hole near the ceiling of the Grand Gallery and scaled up the corbelled walls, managed to enter the small shaft, crawling into a passage with bat dung 16 inches deep. He found, after going about 24 feet, that it opened into a space above the king's chamber. It's now known as the Davison Chamber. You can see it there in the slide. Davison thoughtfully cataloged and sketched 3 species of bats that he identified in the Great Pyramid. Some had a wingspan of 1 foot. Bats, lots of bats, is a theme that keeps appearing in the notebooks of these early explorers. One of the best known of these early explorers of the Giza pyramids is Richard William Howard Weiss. He's remembered for several things, but none more so than his proclivity to resort to dynamite to blast new access routes. Well, he's working about the time that Alfred Nobel is being born. So it's not actually true dynamite, but it's the gunpowder explosives that they used at that time. In the 1830s, he made a highly notable discovery in the Great Pyramid. Another explorer, Caviglia, had begun to blast his way through the south side of the stress-relieving chamber that Davison had found in 1764, expecting to find a communication system with the southern air channel. He thought it would lead to secret rooms, perhaps. Weiss came to suspect that actually there were more chambers above Davison's chamber that he had, because he could poke a reed, like a meter-long reed, up between one end, and it would go up into a space. So he therefore instructed his men to dynamite straight upwards, where he found over a 3.5-month period, and by the way, his journals say he excavated. That really means he's blasting. He discovered 4 additional stress-relieving chambers. And you can see in the diagrams here. They were each roofed, floored, and walled with granite, except for the topmost, which was gabled with limestone blocks so that the weight of the pyramid was deflected around the chambers below. It was Weiss who named these chambers after some of his friends from high places, the Duke of Wellington, Admiral Nelson, and others. What was really important about these discoveries, though, were the numerous graffiti found in red paint in the chambers that are associated with the construction of the pyramid. Along with various leveling lines and markers and directional notations, there were the names of the work gangs, compounded with a form of Khufu's royal name, the Akhet Khufu, and you can see it at the bottom left of the screen. I put it up there. So although scholars had believed that this might be the Pyramid of Khufu, it was this find in these previously unopened chambers that confirmed the ownership of the pyramid. According to New Age folklore, however, Howard Weiss took red paint up into the relieving chambers and forged the builder's graffiti. They want the pyramid to be much older. Mark Lehner and Zawi Hawass write that, quote, "Our own experience and the facts convince us that this is highly improbable." There was another question about the hieratic nature of the text, but it's now been shown that these are typical of Old Kingdom script forms. Charles Piazzi Smith, purists would say that he pronounced his name Smythe, up from Scotland there. But he was born in Italy to a British astronomer who became the Astronomer Royal for Scotland from the 1840s to 1888. He is known for many innovations in astronomy, and especially for his pyramidological and measurement studies of the Great Pyramid of Giza. His book, The Great Pyramid, Its Secrets and Mysteries Revealed, was probably the most influential of 19th century publications in popularizing esoteric interpretations of the Great Pyramid, and it's still quoted to this day. Smith also proposed dates for the second coming of Christ, derived from involved interpretations of the measurements of Khufu's pyramid. He predicted first for 1882, then revised to many dates successively between 1892 and 1911. All proved to be a failure, in case you were wondering. The theories of Smith gained many prominent supporters and also detractors in the field of Egyptology during the late 1800s. But by the end of the 19th century, it lost most of its mainstream scientific support. The greatest blow in theory was dealt by the great Egyptologist, Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie, who had initially been a supporter. He'd been enamored with Smith's theories. When Petrie went to Egypt in 1880 to perform new measurements, he found that the pyramid was several feet smaller than previously believed. This so severely undermined Smith's theories that Petrie rejected it, writing, "The theories of the widths and heights of the passages are all connected, as the passages are all of the same section, or multiples of that." In other words, he's saying if you change part, then you upend the coherence of the theories, dependent theories. The entrance passage, for example, and a lot was based on this, the width and the diagonal and so forth. He remeasured, and I don't think I'll read all of his numbers here, but he's extremely precise. In fact, in some cases, he would measure a dozen times with a theodolite and record and then calculate the mean deviation and so forth. Extremely precise. So he concluded that it's not possible to determine or to make the pyramid a model of the world as Smith had proposed, because the dimensions weren't that accurate. So Petrie had begun his interest in Egypt as a small child, allegedly learning some of the hieroglyphic signs before age 6. In 1866, Petrie read another of Charles Piazzi Smith's books, Our Inheritance in the Great Pyramid, and he became excited by the possibility of reconciling science and religion. Nevertheless, let me show you a picture of some of his measurements. Hundreds of measurements across the Giza  surrounding all 3 pyramids and other structures. again, making in some cases, multiples of each measurement, convinced him that, that the previous measurements were artificially contrived and couldn't be depended upon for some of these extrapolations. Petrie's dimensions, by the way, have stood the test of time and are used up to the current day in many cases for discussion of the Giza Plateau and its dimensions. Theosophy, how to summarize Theosophy. I first read about Madame Blavatsky and Theosophy when I was in my teens. Later, when spending some months on a kibbutz in the Carmel Hills, the Mount Carmel area of Israel, a young traveler passed through for a few days. He must have been about 20 years old, and he told me, or told us, that he was a theosophist and was visiting places of power. Since I already knew about Theosophy, I talked to him a bit more. One day he went to Megiddo, which was reported or reputed to be a location of a vortex of power. And it was nearby, within hitchhiking distance. When he returned, I asked him if he had felt any vibrations, but he seemed disappointed and admitted that he hadn't felt anything. In a nutshell, Blavatsky drew on a blend of Hinduism, Tibetan religion, although her claims to have lived in Tibet are improbable, considering that foreigners weren't allowed in at that time, and there's no record of her being there. Gnosticism and elements of Hermeticism all blended together. She stated that the universe emanated from a divine principle, with each particle of matter being infused with a spark of the divine. Lower orders emanated from higher ones before becoming increasingly dense and being absorbed back into the divine principle. So there are beings on different vibrational levels. Our goal is to elevate our consciousness to higher planes, either in this life or in future reincarnations. And you probably can't see the fine text, but in this diagram on the screen, one particular aspect of it shows multiple physical planes. So in some cases, it was believed you could adjust your vibrational rates and glimpse other levels. As some would argue, Bigfoot materializes in ours from a lower plane. But anyway, the Great Pyramid, according to Blavatsky, was much more ancient than the Egyptian culture. Cheops never built it, she wrote. It was built ages before him, and he only desecrated it by giving it another use. That's from her collected writings, book 4. Edgar Cayce also contributed to popular ideas about what the Great Pyramid might signify. Cayce, if you're not familiar with him, was also called the Sleeping Prophet, a 20th century clairvoyant, the first half of the 20th century, and who popularized the idea of automatic writing. This is when individuals enter a trance-like state and write spontaneously on various subjects. It's basically channeling on paper. Cayce's work often related narratives of Atlantis, the mysteries of the pyramid builders, and reincarnation philosophy and other New Age beliefs. He claimed that the survivors of Atlantis founded ancient Egyptian civilization, and that the Giza Plateau, probably the Sphinx, so that at the Giza Plateau, or probably at the Sphinx, or between the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid, hid what he called a Hall of Records. This so-called Hall of Records purportedly contained the wisdom and knowledge of the Atlantean civilization. So this belief was widely adopted by New Age and ancient astronaut ideas of the 1960s and 70s, and is still popular in fringe archaeological circles. So hold that thought, the Hall of Records. I'll be mentioning that again. Ancient astronauts, we're kind of going chronologically here. Erich von Daniken, a Swiss author with an early penchant for fraud, and I've listed there a few of the occurrences. You know, I would kind of agree with Suetonius in his biographies of the Caesars when he notes about Nero that, you know, some escapades can be excused when young men are in their youth, but if they never outgrow them, there's something of a moral problem there. And in the case of von Daniken, I listed 3 here. When he was 19 was his first theft occurrence, but over 12, and then there was the Egyptian instance when he was involved with fraud and later taken to court in Switzerland. But the main one was when he was a hotel manager. For 12 years, he was forging, using people's documents who came to visit, and then writing checks and so forth, to the tune of about $130,000 in 1970. for which he spent a year in jail when he was caught. I mean, that's like $1 million practically now. You could buy a couple of 3 houses with that back then. You know, so he didn't really grow out of that for quite a while. But you probably see him if you ever watch Ancient Aliens. Not that I would recommend it, but he's still on screen. So von Daniken rose to fame, and by the way, when he was in prison, he wrote his second book. So when he got out, he had the circuit to make, for a speaking tour. In any rate, in Chariots, the first book, he said, quote, "If we meekly accept the neat package of knowledge that the Egyptologists serve up to us, ancient Egypt appears suddenly and without transition, a fantastic ready-made civilization. Great cities, enormous temples, colossal statues with tremendous expressive power, splendid streets flanked by magnificent sculptures, perfect drainage systems, luxurious tombs carved out of the rock, pyramids of overwhelming size, these and many other wonderful things shot out of the ground, so to speak. Genuine miracles in a country that is suddenly capable of such achievements without recognizable prehistory." A few pages later, he drives the point home. Several 100,000 workers pushed and pulled blocks weighing 12 tons up a ramp with, and he puts it in parentheses, non-existent ropes on non-existent rollers. This host of workers lived on non-existent grain. They slept in non-existent huts, and so forth. His research was shoddy then, but we also know substantially more now: construction techniques. So what do we have to go on? From early dynastic periods, the period, and the earliest beginnings of the unified Egypt, burials were made in what are called mastabas, coming from the Arabic term for the bench, which was typically found outside Egyptian homes. And you can see the diagram there of a mastaba. It has a mud brick rectangular upper construction above ground, but the burial occurs underground. You go down through a tunnel, and then there's a burial chamber. And there's usually 2, because you have the Ba and the Ka in Egyptian religion. And this continued onward until we get to the time of Djoser and the step pyramid. This is what is so unusual. Imhotep, his vizier, or his right-hand man for his government, had the idea of stacking mastabas. So he started with this rectangular structure and put a smaller one on top. And from the cutaway, you can see that archaeologically we can determine stages of construction. The king wasn't dead yet, so it was expanded at ground level and then built up from a wider base. And true to the mastaba style of architecture, the burial chamber was below the superstructure in the ground. This continued, well, there was never another step pyramid, but there were a few attempts, actually in the third dynasty as well. Sechemchet, his mastaba / failed step pyramid is still extant up to kind of a second step attempt. But with the beginning of the fourth dynasty, Sneferu, the ambitious individual that he was, made 3 attempts at a radically new design for a burial monument. Rather than having a series of mastabas in step fashion building up, he desired to have a smooth-sided structure. And the problem was the Egyptian engineering hadn't developed to that stage. So the first attempt that we see is the diagram here, the pyramid at Meidun. And it appears to have failed. It was based on a corbelled structure where you have sort of vertical sloping piles of block and brick. And most people have thought that the evidence suggests that it collapsed. Now, there are other views that said it was just never finished or et cetera, but it does look like there was a catastrophic architectural failure in its design. The site was then abandoned, and Sneferu tried a second time. And this is with the bent pyramid at Dashur. The bent pyramid begins at a very aggressive angle, but there was a problem. The ground wasn't stable. They hadn't thought to check the geological soundness for foundational sturdiness, and there were other problems in the structure. It began to crack. So they radically brought in the slope to about 34 degrees, I think it is, 43 to 30, initially 30, and brought it in and finished it off. It makes an interesting profile on the horizon, but apparently Snefru wasn't entirely pleased, and they moved on for one more attempt, the Red Pyramid, which, continuing with the slope, the angle of the upper part of the bent pyramid, was successful. It was built on solid ground. They utilized a more stable form of brick and stone layout, and it was a success. And many archaeologists believe that that's where he was buried. Snefru had established a tradition, and his son, Khufu, who we know as Cheops in Greek, then built the Great Pyramid, the tallest structure ever built until the Eiffel Tower. So it reigned supreme for 4,000 years. And then the successor, and so forth. These are truly remarkable structures, and many questions remain about them. They've been mapped in great detail. The chambers are fun to enter if you get a ticket, although many of the tunnels are not open. For example, the descending tunnel that goes deep underneath Khufu's pyramid it's less than 4 feet in height. And the original explorers must have been very intrepid. And they went down in these. They could hardly breathe, and there was another more vertical tunnel that connected. And when they opened that up, all the dirt and debris piled down on them, and there's bats flying around. One explorer recounts how he could hardly breathe, and he's coughing up blood. But they didn't give up. They kept exploring. But what about their function? Is the function of the Great Pyramid and its neighbors really ambiguous? I don't think so. Look at the plan here. We have a mortuary temple around it. We know very well from Middle and New Kingdom, particularly, the mortuary temples were for the continued reverence and worship of the deified king, with priestly guilds and so forth that supported those operations. You can see storage chambers. You have approaches from the Nile River. It looks clearly to be within the tradition of Egyptian burial practices. Nevertheless, many people have speculated, and if you look at these diagrams, you have constellations overlaid with various angles. The one on the top right points up, and if you can read the small text, it says something about spacecraft reference frame. Yeah. So people imagine various things, but I think if you take all the data together, it's fairly conclusive. And indeed, the plateau itself, does it really align with Orion? Do we have a model of Orion's belt? Well, I don't know, but the angle with which they are laid out, just look at the topographical map. It's on an escarpment, and paralleling, nearly on both sides of that line of 3 pyramids, it drops off. So they're simply utilizing the available space and the layout that would require on the Giza Plateau. But what are the construction theories? Well, if we begin with the Egyptian texts themselves, we have the papyrus that actually shows, or a tomb painting that actually shows the movement of a massive statue. There it is. And you can see there are gangs of men pulling with ropes a sledge on which rests a massive statue. And there are the administrators and directors calling out, and they're pouring water in front, apparently to assist in the sliding of the sled over the sand. That's one datum point. We don't know exactly how the Egyptians approached building such a large structure. There are 3 main theories. I mean, Herodotus suggested that they used cranes of some sort. There's no evidence for that, although the shaduf, the water system of ancient Egypt, would be one analog, I suppose. You could have the straight ramp, but that seems to have entailed too much volume, much more than the pyramid itself, to have been practical. Perhaps a bent or wrapped ramp system, or more recently is the proposal that there's an internal ramp system. This one is very clever, and I think warrants further consideration. Bob Breyer, Egyptologist, has published on this, and I think it also holds up to the analysis of the actual physical pyramid. There are some hints that that may have been how it was constructed. Getting back to current projects on the Giza Plateau, We have work done by archaeologists, Zahi Hawass, Mark Lehner. Mark Lehner particularly has become a decades-long expert on the Giza Plateau. Here are a couple of books he's published. One is very large and thick. It's really the culmination of a couple centuries of research and his own work. And he has focused on this village, the workers' village, not far from the summit of the Giza Plateau. And from this, we can now answer von Daniken's questions about the workers. Yes, we know now about the workers. We know what they ate. We know about the royal estates that the pharaoh established to provide cattle to feed them. We know that they got select cuts. There was fish, high protein diets. We know that they had repetitive stress injuries and sometimes catastrophic injuries. But they weren't slaves. They were working during the time of the inundation of the Nile when you couldn't farm. And many were specialists. From this work emerges a picture of the Giza area as one of integration with the Nile River. At any rate, the Nile River has now been determined through soundings and coring to have had a harbor just at the foot of the mortuary temples extending from the pyramid complex. One final discovery recently, beginning in 2013, a series of papyri were found at the Wadi Al Jarf, an Old Kingdom harbor on the Red Sea. It was excavated by the Paris-Sorbonne team. And a series of papyri, you can see one of the caves there, had been carried there by this particular team and left. Actually, there were still coils of ropes in other parts of this harbor that were intact from the Middle Kingdom period. But these documents were very important in reconstructing what was going on. We know about the team that carried that boated and shipped the limestone blocks to the pyramid. We know now for sure this background information. So they spell out in some detail how during the inundation, they carried the quarried stone, and then during the rest of the year, they went over to the Red Sea port and brought back turquoise and minerals from the Sinai Peninsula. One more thing. Mark Lehner, the prominent scholar on the pyramids in Giza Plateau that I've been talking about, stated this story about his early years. He says, I went first to Egypt in 1972 as a tourist, and then back in 1973, the following year, as a student at the American University in Cairo. It's no secret that when I went, I myself was imbued with the ideas of lost civilizations and inspired by a man named Edgar Cayce. So I was, in fact, myself looking for the lost civilization and something called the Hall of Records, or at least those ideas were on my mind. Lehner continues, to make a long story short, those ideas didn't stand up against the bedrock of reality. And so then I was still fascinated with these pyramids and by the Sphinx. I asked the question, well, what then is the real story? What is the story that the site itself has to tell? And so that's what sustained me and kept me out there in a kind of exploratory mode. At first, under the auspices of the Stanford Research Institute, you might know that it was also the sponsor of the remote viewing program by the US military, Project Stargate, later made into the movie, Men Who Stare at Goats. Lehner went on to found the Ancient Egypt Research Associates, AERA, and became a world's premier expert really on the Giza Plateau and associated architectural remains, including the pyramids. He has gone on the record as stating, you don't responding to alternative theories of the Great Sphinx by stating, and this is where I have the picture of Schock and his book on the Sphinx. You don't overthrow Egyptian history based on one phenomenon like a weathering profile, Dr. Lehner said. That's how pseudoscience is done, not real science. His advice regarding Robert Schock's theory of a terminal ice age date for the Sphinx would equally apply to an Atlantean theories of a technological civilization constructing the Great Pyramid. Where is the evidence of that civilization, he said. Where are the pottery sherds? People during that age were hunters and gatherers. They didn't build cities. There is no condemnation in starting with curiosity and an open mind to new ideas, like Petrie, like Mark Lehner. But let the data lead, and let it lead you to the real story. That is truly amazing. And there's still more out there for the next generation to discover. Thank you.
If there's one quick question, we could probably take that. Otherwise, we're going to go on to the next. But if there's a burning question, yes. Sorry. Okay.
With all that weight, are the pyramids shrinking?
No, they're a pretty solid limestone bedrock. But they shrink in a sense in that people have deprecated their coverings and taken away the limestone casing and the capstone. And climbing it probably doesn't help too much either.
Thank you. One more in the back here, and then we'll go on to the next lecture.
Yeah, what do you think of this recent muon tomography that they believe they're finding empty spaces?
Oh, that's really good technology. So the muons are the big brothers of, electrons, same class of particles. And they're heavy, so they actually go through a bit of matter before they're captured. And muon scanning was developed to look inside volcanoes, to image to see when the lava magma is rising. So this is incredible technology. And the first series of muon scans is completed with evidence of a large void above the Grand Gallery, so that angled ascent up to the King's Chamber. Nearly as large. It could be a deflecting area, again, just as over the King's Chamber, we have those series of spaces. Or it could be a hidden chamber. I mean, wouldn't that be a dream to find Khufu's intact burial chamber? I mean, fantastic. So a second round of greatly higher resolution will make a 3D sort of tomography, like a CAT scan really. But they're still working on the technology to upgrade the panels and the readings. But stay tuned, it's really exciting.